I recently went to a class put on by Wasatch Freeze Dry where I learned more about some of the ins and outs of freeze drying. It was enlightening and helped me to see that freeze drying is such an art. One thing I learned that blew my mind was to freeze dry breast milk in the bags it was originally pumped into in order to minimize exposure and handling of the milk itself. Fun fact, some plastics can go into freeze dryers. Since the breast milk bags I have are BPA free and I use a low freeze drying temperature of 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is less than the temperature of the human body, it made sense to try it out. Now, what I understood from class is to leave the breast milk in the bags, prop the opening of each bag open using a small tool like a spoon, and to make sure the bag is tilted upward. I obviously went about it slightly differently using what I had, which were food-grade bamboo skewers to keep the bags propped open. I love the simplicity of pulling my frozen breast milk bags out and simply weighing them, propping it open with a little bamboo skewer, and sending it on its way to get freeze-dried. When I checked the contents after its initial run, I noticed most bags seemed quite dry. However, right off the bat, there were 2 bags that clearly had moisture inside still. When I touched it, there were large chunks inside that still felt frozen, so I added more time. After about 40 hours, I pulled the trays out. As I checked the milk, some of them looked great. I could crunch them right up into powder and see that they were dry. But in the mix, there were also a few bags that were still partially frozen, which means it hadn't been freeze-dried completely. I started feeling concerned about it taking an unusually long amount of time to freeze dry this amount of milk. Normally with twice the amount of milk, it would be complete by now. For fear that I might ruin the milk if I wasn't going to be able to remove the moisture fully, I went ahead and emptied each bag onto the trays to finish freeze drying them that way. Once laid out, I could see the extent of the moisture that was left behind, especially once the pieces that were still frozen started melting. There was at least a little moisture left on 3 of the 5 trays. I also noticed there were little clumps of fatty milk, which is such a bummer because fatty clumps don't freeze dry well. It doesn't really dry into a powder, it feels a little pasty instead. Anyways, the trays went back into the freeze dryer and started from the beginning of the process. The total time it took to complete this batch of breast milk ended up being somewhere near 55 hours, which is really more than it should have been. Here is a recap of the pros and cons I found with freeze drying breast milk in their bagged containers. Pros. Prep work was simple and quick. The huge and obvious benefit of minimizing contact with the milk, especially when doing freeze-dried breast milk as a service to others, this is such a huge consideration to take into account. Cons. It freeze-dried unevenly. I couldn't fit as much milk onto a tray. Bags with more than 6 ounces inside would be too thick to lay on a tray. The uniformity of the bag, so different amounts of milk inside wouldn't freeze dry very evenly. Fatty clumps didn't freeze dry well, and it ended up needing quite a bit of additional dry time. This isn't to say that freeze drying breast milk in bags does not work. I just think I'll need to make some adjustments and go about it a little differently than I did. Before I share how I plan to do this, what are your thoughts about how to make freeze drying milk in bags more foolproof?